Jeffrey Dahmer met his death this morning while working as a janitor, cleaning a prison bathroom.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're looking at 50 criminals who met violent ends while serving time in prison.
The beating was so savage, 89-year-old Bulger was unrecognizable when his body was found.
Billy Wright.
Billy Wright, one of the most sinister figures to emerge from 30 years of violence.
Do you feel like you can't be killed?
Going by the wonderful nickname King Rat, Billy Wright was a prominent Northern Irish loyalist and leader of the Loyalist Volunteer Force. He was heavily involved in violent paramilitary activity during the Troubles and staunchly opposed the peace process, often killing innocent Catholic civilians. Wright was eventually arrested for making death threats and imprisoned in the high-security Maze prison in 1997. Despite warnings about threats to his life, he was housed near inmates belonging to LVF's rivals, the Irish National Liberation Army. On December 27, 1997, INLA members smuggled weapons into the prison and assassinated Wright inside a van, shooting him multiple times at close range. The hit raised serious concerns about security failures at the facility, with many suspecting collusion by prison authorities.
There were many more dark days to come for the people of Northern Ireland before that ceasefire would come to pass.
Felix Mitchell.
My grandmother was staying in the 69th village. And at the time is when Felix Mitchell was the biggest heroin drug kingpin at the time.
Known as Felix the Cat, Felix Mitchell was a notorious Oakland drug lord who led a heroin empire called the 69 Mob. At its peak, his enormous operation was generating up to $400,000 a month. But in 1985, Mitchell was convicted on charges of running a criminal enterprise and was sentenced to life in prison. On August 21, 1986, just 1 year into his lengthy sentence, Mitchell was fatally stabbed by another inmate at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. The killer's motive remains unclear, though some reports suggest it was over a $10 drug debt. Mitchell's lavish and controversial funeral in Oakland drew thousands of onlookers, featuring the likes of a horse-drawn carriage and a dozen Rolls-Royce limousines.
Just when the East Bay thought one of its most notorious hoods was gone forever, he came back to star in a funeral production fit for a king. Alas, it was his own.
Rufus McCain.
December 3rd, 1940. The brutal slaying of inmate Rufus McCain occurs in the prison tailor shop, bringing convicted killer Henri Young to San Francisco to stand trial for first-degree murder.
When you think of prisoners escaping from Alcatraz, you probably think of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, who disappeared into the night on June 11, 1962, and were never seen again. But over 20 years earlier, another attempt was made by Rufus McCain and 4 others. On the night of January 13, 1939, the 5 men attempted to escape Alcatraz, but unlike Morris and the Anglins, they were all caught before making it to the water. McCain and another inmate, Henry Young, were sentenced to 22 months in solitary for the attempt. They were eventually released back into the prison population, but Young, likely suffering the brutal psychological effects of isolation, stabbed McCain to death with a sharpened wooden spoon.
And to say that he had descended into pure animality and that he could no longer distinguish between right and wrong was an easy thing to say.
Lorenzo Chierici. A prominent Italian fascist, Lorenzo Chierici served as chief of police under Benito Mussolini in 1943. After Mussolini's ousting on July 25th, Chierici was removed from his post, but later reinstated by Prime Minister Pietro Badoglio as a lieutenant colonel in the Royal Italian Army. Following the Armistice of Castibile, which ended fighting between Italy and the Allies, Chierici was arrested by the Nazis and handed over to the Italian Social Republic. Branded a traitor, Chierici was thrown in prison and was later murdered inside his own cell. These specific events remain unclear, and the motives are still questioned, although most believe that he was silenced in order to prevent his testimony at the upcoming Verona trial. Angelo La Barbera.
Michael Francis Rizzi, do you renounce Satan?
I do renounce him.
Even mob bosses aren't immune to prison retaliations. Angelo La Barbera was a prominent Sicilian mafioso who, alongside his brother Salvatore, led the Palermo Centro family. playing a key role in the first mafia war of the early 60s. Convicted of 7 murders, La Barbera received a 22-year sentence in the trial of the 114, which was one of the first large-scale efforts by the Italian state to confront the Sicilian mafia. In 1975, he was imprisoned in Perugia, where on October 28th, he was fatally stabbed by 3 fellow inmates. Reports suggest the murder was ordered by the Greco family, possibly to prevent him from exposing politicians with ties to the mafia.
I'm a retired investor living on a pension. I came home to vote in the presidential election because they wouldn't give me an absentee ballot.
Kurt Gustav Vilkins. This German anarchist became known for assassinating Argentine military officer Colonel Hector Varela in 1923. Just a few years earlier, Varela had killed hundreds during a brutal suppression of striking laborers in Patagonia, and Vilkins wanted revenge. He surrendered immediately after the assassination and was imprisoned in Buenos Aires, and his presence drew attention owing to his strong political stance. On June 15, 1923, Vilkins was murdered by Jorge Ernesto Perez Millan, a right-wing paramilitary officer who was smuggled into the prison. Millan's killing of Vilkins was also motivated by revenge, fueling the cycle of political violence that was prevalent in Argentina at the time. Tong Guisen.
我以前没得选择，现在我想做一个好人。好，跟法官说。
This Taiwanese gangster was a member of the United Bamboo Gang, which is one of the country's most powerful triads. Tong gained international notoriety for his involvement in the 1984 assassination of Henry Liu, a prominent journalist critical of the Chinese Nationalist Party, which rules the Republic of China in Taiwan. After years on the run, Tong was eventually captured, extradited to the United States, and sentenced to life in prison. He served his time in Pennsylvania's Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary, and on February 21, 1991, Tong was stabbed in a prison brawl over cigarettes. He was grievously injured and stayed alive for over a month, but ultimately died from his injuries on April 3rd. John Mansfield. Back in 2006, British man John Mansfield broke into the home of his 63-year-old neighbor Anne Alfonso and attacked her with a knife. Alfonso died after receiving dozens of stab wounds, and police say that Mansfield had hoped to rob her of her spare change. Mansfield was sent to HMP Whitemore, where he was detained in the Close Supervision Center owing to his history of violence with other inmates. According to prison officials, those held in CSC are often considered the worst of the worst and are prone to inflicting violence on other inmates. Indeed, on April 13, 2025, Mansfield died from horrific head injuries that were sustained in an attack. He was 63 years old, the same age as Anne Alfonso. Ivan Colonna.
A tiny village on the edge of the Mediterranean carries the weight of an island in mourning. Draped with a Corsican flag are the remains of Ivan Colonna, the village shepherd who defied the French state.
A Corsican nationalist, Ivan Colonna was convicted for the assassination of Claude Erignac, a French prefect of Corsica who was killed in an act of resistance against French rule. Arrested in 2003 after years on the run, Colonna consistently denied involvement, but was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. On March 2, 2022, Colonna was violently attacked by fellow inmate and radicalized Islamist Franck Elong Abbé. The assault was reportedly motivated by religious grievances, with Abbé claiming that Colonna had, quote, disrespected Muhammad. Colonna was in a coma for 3 weeks, but he never recovered and died on March 21st. His death sparked outrage and protests in Corsica, further reigniting tensions between the French government and Corsican nationalists.
He's on every street corner. Ivan Colonna has become, since his death, a symbol of Corsican nationalism and resistance.
Rodolfo Cadena.
Coming out?
Nicknamed Cheyenne, Rodolfo Cadena was a prominent leader of the prison gang Mexican Mafia, or La M. Born in San Antonio and raised in California, Cadena became involved in gang activity at an early age, leading to his incarceration at age 16 for murder. While imprisoned, he rose through La M's ranks, eventually seeking to unify various gangs, including the Nuestra Familia, in order to reduce violence. However, this initiative was opposed by La M leaders, who ordered hits on rival gang members, undermining Cadena's peace efforts and even marking him for death. On December 17, 1972, Cadena was ambushed by NF members, stabbed approximately 50 times, thrown from the third-story floor, and stabbed another dozen times on the ground.
You coming out, is that? Yeah.
Larry Davis.
Well, on February 20th, 2008, around 7 p.m., a correctional officer that was overlooking the yard saw a bunch of inmates kind of congregating around an argument between, I guess, you and Larry Davis.
This Bronx native gained notoriety in 1986 after engaging in a huge shootout with the NYPD, during which 6 officers were shot and wounded. Davis evaded capture for over 2 weeks before surrendering. Though acquitted of attempted murder, Davis was later convicted in 1991 for the murder of suspected drug dealer Raymond Vizcaino and sentenced to 25 years to life. On February 20, 2008, while incarcerated at New York's Shawangunk Correctional Facility, Davis was fatally stabbed multiple times by fellow Crip inmate Luis Rosado. Davis lost an incredible amount of blood in the attack, and the prison nurse called for emergency transport after being unable to treat him. He was already dead by the time he arrived at St. Luke's Hospital.
I ended up stabbing him, and if he was the actual target, I would kept stabbing him because I was already caught. I don't try to get away. You know what I'm saying? So I left him when he fell on the floor. I left him there, and I went chasing the other guy.
Jesse Anderson.
Hey, guys are getting some help this morning.
Sure. Fine by me.
Everyone remembers or knows about Jeffrey Dahmer being murdered in prison, but what some people forget is that there was another victim that day. He was Jesse Anderson, an inmate serving life in prison after murdering his wife and blaming the attack on 2 black men. Anderson was serving time alongside Dahmer in Wisconsin's Columbia Correctional Institution, and they were both scheduled to clean the prison gym with another inmate, Christopher Scarver. Anderson was severely beaten by Scarver while out on detail, and he died 2 days later from his injuries. Like Dahmer, it's believed that Anderson was killed for targeting black men in his crime.
Jesse?
Paulie Bartlett.
I ain't gonna kill you. But by the time I'm finished with you, you're gonna wish you was dead.
I've been wishing I was dead for a long time.
While the story is locally regarded as a fanciful folktale, Paulie Bartlett is said to be the first serial killer in the history of Wyoming. Bartlett reportedly owned a beautiful lodge, which would house rich travelers heading west in the mid-19th century. She would provide them with a warm meal and whiskey, but would poison the meal, steal their belongings, and bury the travelers on her property. Investigators later found a total of 22 bodies buried around the lodge. Bartlett was later arrested for the murders and put in a jail cell to await trial. But before it could even begin, Bartlett was shot through the cell window by a German immigrant named Otto Kalkhorst.
You still want that kiss?
Earl Krugal. This violent activist was an acting member of the Jewish Defense League, a far-right organization that purports to physically resist anti-Semitism. In November 2001, Krugal was arrested after receiving a large shipment of gunpowder. When questioned, Krugal admitted that he was making an explosive device in order to bomb both the King Fahd Mosque in Culver City and the office of Arab American Congressman Darrell Issa. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, serving his time in Phoenix's Federal Correctional Institution. On November 4, 2005, Krugal was using an exercise machine when a neo-Nazi named David Jennings approached him from behind and bludgeoned him to death with a block of concrete. Munna Bajarangi. Born Prem Prakash Singh, Munna Bajarangi was a notorious Indian gangster and politician from Uttar Pradesh. Active primarily in the 1990s, Bajarangi was linked to multiple criminal activities, including extortion and various murders, serving as a professional contract killer. Bajarangi later gained notoriety after allegedly killing a member of the Legislative Assembly, Krishnanand Rai, in 2005. On July 9, 2018, just a day after being transferred to Bagput jail for a court hearing, Bajarangi was shot dead inside the prison. His assassin was fellow gangster and prisoner Sunil Ratti. When asked why he had murdered Bajarangi, Ratti said that he had called him chubby. Richard Huckle.
In Huckle's hometown, news of his crimes have shocked his friends and acquaintances. They're trying to understand the enormity of what he did.
One of Britain's most notorious criminals was Richard Huckle, a young man who spent a lot of time in Malaysia. While there, Huckle spent his days doing freelance photography, studying IT, and working as a Christian missionary. But it was also during this time that Huckle committed dozens of horrible sexual offenses. Huckle was eventually arrested by the National Crime Agency and convicted of 71 counts of sexual assault, resulting in life in prison. On October 13, 2019, Huckle was killed in his cell by a fellow inmate named Paul Fitzgerald. This attack shocked the prosecution that was trying Fitzgerald for the murder, who called it a, quote, sadistic and, quote, prolonged attack. Fitzgerald was given an extra 34 years for killing Huckle.
It appears his parents sold up and moved away as soon as they could. His elder brother did not want to discuss him. Huckle's sister-in-law told me,
"None of his family will speak about him. None of us ever want to see Richard again."
Nikolai Ratkovich, a Russian serial killer from the early 20th century. Nikolai Ratkovich began his spree after being expelled by the Cadet Corps.
This was not a good time to be disgraced and out of work in Russia. The economic conditions in the country were not good.
Wanting to purge the world of what he considered depraved and immoral women, Ratkovich killed 3 sex workers between June and September of 1909. He was finally apprehended on September 17th, immediately after killing his 3rd and final victim in a hotel.
He called for the doorman to stop him, and along with other staff, the doorman managed to wrestle Nikolai Ratkovich to the ground.
He was sentenced to 8 years in the katorga, a Russian form of punishment in which prisoners were sent off to Siberia to perform forced labor. Ratkovich spent 4 years in these brutal conditions before he was killed by fellow inmates. John Jairo Moreno Torres. Known as Johnny the Leper from a childhood injury, Colombian killer John Jairo Moreno Torres caused trouble from a young age. He dropped out of school at 13 and joined the most feared gang in Bogota, selling drugs and committing a number of violent crimes. He officially killed 4 people throughout his time as the gang's leader, but it's believed that he may have murdered up to 20. He also committed a number of assaults before he was apprehended in February 1998, still just a teenager. He was sent to Bogota's La Modelo prison and was violently executed by other prisoners, who shot Torres 12 times with a smuggled firearm. Colin Hatch. Called both highly dangerous and a menace to the public, Colin Hatch was sentenced to life back in 1994 for committing an unspeakable crime.
When he was jailed in 1994, Colin Hatch was told he was so dangerous it would never be safe to release him and he would die in prison.
Hatch had a history of similar behavior and was sent to a maximum facility in Yorkshire called HM Prison Full Sutton. He remained in the prison for almost 2 decades, but his life was cut short in February of 2011. In what prison officials called, quote, an accident, Hatch was ambushed by another inmate named Damien Fowkes, who had a history of attacking prisoners involved with a certain type of crime.
At his trial, Colin Hatch had said he'd be a dead man if he were sent to prison, and so it proved. Humberside police are now questioning 35-year-old fellow prisoner Damien Fowkes in connection with his death.
Ian Huntley, another prominent victim of Fowkes, survived his attack. Hatch was not so lucky, and he died from the injuries that Fowkes had caused. Enriqueta Marti, known by creepy names like the Vampire of Barcelona, Enriqueta Marti was a Spanish serial killer who is thought to have murdered 12 victims in the early 1900s.
There had been reports that children had gone missing from some of Barcelona's poorer neighbourhoods, and it was alleged that Enriqueta was involved in taking these children, and without remorse.
Unfortunately, the records of these crimes are quite scarce, owing to both the time period and the economic situation of her victims, leading some to question Marti's guilt. Adding to the general confusion is the lack of a trial. Marti was arrested and held in the Reina Amalia jail but was killed before her trial could begin. The official story is that Marti was attacked by her fellow inmates and publicly hanged on the jail's patio.
She was buried in a mass grave on the outskirts of Barcelona and took most of the names of the victims and her clients with her.
Billy Shamir. Throughout the late 2010s, Texas man Billy Shamir would pose as a maintenance man and break into the homes of elderly women. He would then attack the women while they were alone and smother them with a pillow.
At a press conference yesterday, family members of the victims Shamir was charged with killing gathered to truly share their reactions.
While Shamir was officially convicted of just 2 deaths, police believe he's responsible for dozens of murders around the greater Dallas area. He was convicted of the deaths of Luthi Harris and Mary Brooks, resulting in 2 life sentences in the H.H. Cofield unit of Texas. While inside, Shamir made some inappropriate comments about the family of a cellmate and was subsequently beaten to death, and possibly even stabbed with a pen.
This morning, there's a lot of comments, and I've been reading through them all morning long, and let's just be honest, there's none that are really appropriate to air on television this morning. Let's just say he won't be missed.
Robert Liberty. In 1966, Robert Liberty attempted to take his own life but failed and was placed in the Orange County Medical Center. There, he met 31-year-old Marcella Landis, and the two entered a relationship. Soon after, Liberty strangled Landis to death with a stocking. He was declared legally insane and placed in a state hospital until 1969, when he was deemed fit to re-enter society. He soon killed 2 more people, his roommate Thomas Astorina and Robert Irian, a nurse who worked at the state hospital. Liberty was arrested again following an FBI manhunt and once again pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. But before his trial could take place, Liberty was strangled and killed by a cellmate named Timothy Dudley. Robert Simon. Known as Mudman by his peers, Robert Simon was a member of the Philadelphia-based Warlocks Motorcycle Club, an outlaw club with a reputation for violence.
Fire a knife. Answer him.
Even by their standards, Simon was known as a dangerous renegade and was supposedly made the club's enforcer owing to his history of reckless violence. Aside from committing armed robbery and arson, Simon is also known to have killed 2 people, his teenage girlfriend Beth Smith Duesenberg and a New Jersey police officer named Hipólito Gonzalez, who had pulled Simon over during a routine traffic stop.
Immediately following the shooting, both Mudman and Staples tried fleeing the scene, but were soon pursued by nearby police officers who had heard the 2 gunshots on Sergeant Gonzalez's radio request for backup.
The killing of Gonzalez sent Simon to New Jersey State Prison, where he was beaten to death by cellmate Ambrose Harris while awaiting execution. Leslie Bailey. Some crimes are so horrible that the people who commit them have to be segregated in prison.
Although, of course, we all knew that these things went on and they existed, but the degree and the amount involved surprised us all.
That was the case with English serial killer Leslie Bailey, who was a Rule 43 inmate at Whitemore Prison. This meant that Bailey had to be separated from the rest of the prison population, as officials feared that he would be attacked. The rule stems from Bailey's past, as he was linked to various unspeakable crimes, including the deaths of 3 individuals.
In my profession as a police officer, we're in the business of obtaining confessions from people. But I could honestly say I don't really know if I'd ever want to hear another confession again if it was in those circumstances.
Bailey was known to roam with a gang of criminals, and police believe that they were guilty of even more crimes and deaths. Regardless, justice came for Bailey, despite his position in prison. In October of 1993, Bailey was found strangled to death in his cell. Edwin Caprat. With most of his victims being elderly women, Florida man Edwin Caprat earned the moniker the Granny Killer.
Edwin, who was nicknamed Mike by family members, was said to be intelligent and loved reading books, but he was also known to be a very violent and easily angered bully who would go after those smaller and weaker than himself.
Caprat's first victim was a 27-year-old man named Lee Bugay, who had been beaten over the head with a pipe. He then killed a number of elderly individuals throughout 1993, often committing arson in the process and staging their deaths as accidents. An anonymous individual phoned the police and told them to look into Caprat, who had previously been jailed for the death of Bugay. His fingerprints were found at one of the crime scenes, and Caprat was arrested and sentenced to death.
Throughout both trials, Edwin Caprat was uninterested in the proceedings and was supposedly reading a book the entire time.
But on April 19, 1995, Caprat got into a fight with fellow inmates Mario Lara and Rigoberto Sanchez Velasco and was fatally stabbed. Rock Terrio. Considered one of the most notorious criminals in Canadian history, Roch Thériault was a cult leader who founded the doomsday cult Anthill Kids in the 1970s. Claiming to be a prophet, Thériault went by the name Moïse and was known to manipulate his followers, committing horrific acts including physical abuse and murder. The cult was disbanded in 1989 when Thériault was arrested for assault, and he was later convicted for the murder of follower Solange Boilard. While serving his time in Dorchester Penitentiary, Thériault was stabbed in the neck by his cellmate, Matthew MacDonald. MacDonald then reportedly walked to the officer's station and handed them the shiv, saying, quote, "Here's the knife. I've sliced him up." Carl Williams. A prominent drug trafficker, Carl Williams was a powerful figure in the Australian underworld.
He got bigger and bigger, and greedier, as they tend to do.
He played a large role in the Melbourne gangland killings that occurred between 1998 and 2010, with officials believing that he's responsible for at least 10 of the 36 contract killings. He was eventually put away on 4 counts of murder, having personally ordered their deaths.
These people were so prepared to kill that they appeared to have little regard for the safety of innocent people around them.
The victims were Jason and Louis Moran of the prominent Moran family, criminal associate Mark Malia, and Michael Marshall, who was shot and killed in front of his young son. Williams was sent to HM Prison Barwon, where fellow inmate Matthew Charles Johnson bludgeoned him to death with the handle of an exercise bike. Roger Kibby. Dubbed the I-5 Strangler, Roger Kibby was responsible for the assault and deaths of at least 8 women. His killing spree mostly occurred around Sacramento, California between 1977 and 1987, and he would hunt for his victims along the interstate highway, hence the nickname. He was eventually arrested in 1988 and received an initial prison sentence of 25 years to life.
For each victim, Kibby responded in a hoarse, raspy voice saying, "Guilty, guilty," 6 times.
In the following years, more life sentences were added to this as further evidence of his other murders was discovered. On February 28, 2021, while at the Mule Creek State Prison in California, the I-5 Strangler was strangled to death by his cellmate, Jason Boudreau, who reportedly did it in retribution for his crimes.
Shock from victims' families tonight, guys. Those who were directly impacted by Roger Kibby and his serial slayings. But some of these families tonight are saying his death comes 35 years too late.
Gerard John Schaefer.
I never thought that I would be that close to someone who was capable of doing those things.
Gerard John Schaefer was working as a sheriff's deputy in Florida when he abducted 2 young female hitchhikers and tied them up in a remote forest. The teenagers were able to escape after he was called away on police duty. After he claimed he only wanted to show them the risks of hitchhiking, he was apprehended and charged with false imprisonment and aggravated assault. While out on bail, Schaefer abducted and killed 2 other girls and was re-arrested after their decomposed bodies were found in the woods. Schaefer was sentenced to serve 2 concurrent life terms at the Florida State Prison, where in 1995, he was killed by another inmate, Vincent Rivera. Rivera was handed an additional 53 years for the murder.
When I found out that Schaefer had been killed, it was like a horrible stink had just drifted out the window, and for the first time in years, I could breathe fresh air.
Sidonio Tera. In 2008, Sidonio Tera was sentenced to life imprisonment for taking the life of his young daughter and also attempting to murder his son. While serving his sentence at the Long Lartin Top Security Prison in Worcestershire, England, Teixeira was attacked by another inmate while working at the prison workshop. The culprit, Victor Castigador, reportedly put a stone in a sock, which he used to beat Teixeira, who later succumbed to his injuries. Castigador, who claimed to have been purging the world of evil, was found guilty in 1990 of the murders of 2 security guards and was serving a life sentence already. He was subsequently issued a whole life order by the Birmingham Crown Court for killing Teixeira. Donald Leroy Evans.
2 days ago, a 12-member jury sentenced Donald Leroy Evans to death by lethal injection.
Although he was only found guilty of 2 murders, Donald Leroy Evans admitted responsibility in the killings of over 70 people.
He even led the FBI on a 2-day search for bodies in the Arizona desert, but they found nothing.
If true, this would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. On August 1st, 1991, Evans took the life of his last victim, Beatrice Louise Routh, in Mississippi. He was arrested 4 days later and eventually sentenced to death. His crimes also resulted in convictions at the federal level and in the state of Florida. In 1999, while sitting on death row, a fellow inmate named Jimmy Mack decided to bring Evans's execution date a little closer. The two were reportedly in the prison shower when Mack stabbed Evans to his death. Nikolai Fifilof. Over the span of 6 years, Nikolai Fifilof rained terror on the town of Sverdlovsk in the then Soviet Union. In all, he had a victim count of 7, all of whom were female. Fifilof had served in the Soviet army, and it's believed that the motivation for his crimes came from being rejected by a woman he loved. He was arrested in 1988 after being caught by a senior Soviet official trying to dispose of his last victim's body. Fifilof was in jail awaiting trial when he met his demise at the hands of his cellmate on August 30th, 1988. Conspiracies soon arose that his murder was arranged in order to prevent a potentially sensationalized trial. Those claims, however, have never been confirmed. Lauron Williams. In October 1977, Lauron Williams claimed the life of a sex worker in Nashville, Tennessee. Before his trial, he bargained a plea deal that came with a sentence of 10 years imprisonment. He was still serving his time in 1981 when he escaped from the Memphis Correctional Center. While on the run, Williams killed an additional 2 people, a police officer who tried to arrest him and a Catholic priest. He was recaptured soon after and sent back to prison, this time with 2 death sentences. On July 8, 1985, Williams was descended upon by a group of other inmates, reportedly for being on the prison phone for too long. He was left severely injured and ultimately died at a nearby hospital. Daniel Camargo Barbosa. Born in Colombia in 1930, Daniel Camargo Barbosa had a pretty troubling childhood. Prevented from furthering his education by financial constraints, Barbosa eventually fell into a life of crime. He began with petty thefts before escalating into abducting, assaulting, and murdering young girls. Barbosa first went to prison in Colombia, where it is believed that he claimed the lives of more than 80 girls. He escaped from prison and fled to Ecuador, where he continued his despicable actions, later owning up to 72 murders in the country. Barbosa was incarcerated for 16 years, but his sentence was cut short just 5 years in when he was killed by another inmate, who happened to be one of his victim's nephews. Lenko Latkov. Between 1999 and 2000, Lenko Latkov committed 3 murders in the Khaskovo province of the People's Republic of Bulgaria. All of his victims were elderly women, although he also targeted young boys and girls, who he apparently only assaulted. Latkov was suspected of carrying out 3 other murders, but none of them was confirmed before his death. Prior to his trial, he first received psychological evaluations before being transferred to a prison where he was held. Latkov never got the opportunity to answer for his crimes. On the 13th of September 2003, his cellmate, Sami Behram Abdullah, who had been locked up for attempted murder, succeeded in killing him following a heated argument. Lloyd Avery II. You may know Lloyd Avery II from John Singleton's seminal film Boys in the Hood. While he didn't have a large role, it was an important one, as he was one of the Bloods who shoots and kills Ricky Baker. Later, Ice Cube avenges Ricky and kills Avery in a drive-by. 8 years after the movie came out, Avery was sentenced to life in prison after murdering 2 people in a shooting. He was placed in Pelican Bay State Prison alongside cellmate Kevin Roby, a Satanist who was serving time for killing his own sister. On September 4th, 2005, Roby strangled Avery to death, supposedly after Avery tried converting Roby to Christianity.
Yo, cuz. I know why you got the call last night. Shouldn't have been there in the first place.
Elio José Muniz Filho. Elio José Muniz Filho, or Elinho as he was more commonly called, was imprisoned for 201 years for the deaths of 65 people. Born and raised in Pernambuco, Brazil, Elinho was a vigilante killer who sought to, quote, clean up the city by taking out people he deemed to be evil. No matter how good his intentions may have been, this was considered a crime in the eyes of the law, and he was arrested in 1998. Elinho's actions seemed to have won him favor among the residents of the town, as over 3,000 people reportedly signed a petition demanding his release. While serving his sentence, however, he was violently attacked by 3 inmates and later died of his injuries at a hospital. Arur Kitay. Just as the Soviet Union fell in the early 1990s, Arur Kitay embarked on a spree of sex crimes and murders. This earned him the nickname Last Sex Maniac of the USSR. During that period, Kitay had gotten a job as a driver for an auto company. With his official vehicle, he preyed on young female hitchhikers around the city of Smolensk, claiming the lives of 6 of them. Kitay was arrested in July of 1992 and sentenced to death 2 years later, although this was eventually commuted to a life term. The Russian killer remained in prison until September 2019, when an argument with his cellmate ended in a brutal attack that ultimately resulted in Kitayev's demise. Thor Nes Christensen.
Thor Christensen terrified a town.
No conscience whatsoever. Zero.
Born in Denmark, Thor Nes Christensen was brought to the U.S. by his parents at the age of 5. Although a bright student in high school, Christensen later lost interest in his studies and dropped out to work at a gas station. Around this time, he began harboring despicable thoughts, which he then made a reality after stealing a pistol from a friend. He was responsible for the deaths of 4 women, but his murderous spree came to an end when his intended 5th victim survived the ordeal and led the police to him months later.
This guy thinks what he did was all right.
While serving a life sentence at Folsom State Prison, Christensen was wounded in the exercise yard by an unidentified prisoner and later succumbed to his injuries. Jose Antonio Rodriguez Vega. Dubbed El Mataviejas, which translates to the Old Lady Killer in English, Jose Antonio Rodriguez Vega rained terror on elderly women in Cantabria, an autonomous community in Spain. In the span of just 8 months, Rodriguez Vega wormed his way into the hearts and homes of several women in the area and took the lives of at least 16 of them. Upon his arrest, Rodriguez Vega confessed to the crimes, but later recanted his confession during his trial. Regardless, he was found guilty and sentenced to 440 years in prison. After serving only a fraction of his sentence, Rodriguez Vega met his end at the hands of 2 inmates at his prison in Salamanca, who brutally attacked him in the common area. John Gagan.
So how can I help you guys?
You're familiar with the Gagan case?
Sure. 80 plaintiffs, all of them individual cases.
It was the investigation into John Gagan that opened the floodgates for the Catholic Church abuse allegations that permeated the 2000s. Gagan was a Roman Catholic priest who was accused of horrible crimes throughout the greater Boston area. Following a thorough investigation into the countless allegations, Gagan was convicted of sexual abuse and sentenced to 10 years in prison in the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center. While there, he met Joseph Druce, a murderer who had been abused in boarding school. Desiring revenge against Gagan and what he represented, Druce confronted the ex-priest in his cell, jammed the door closed, and proceeded to stomp him to death.
Baron wants us to scrub the Gagan case.
That's great.
Can we cover Gagan? Yeah, there's a lawyer alleging Cardinal Law knew about it.
Leopold Zion. The crimes of Leopold Zion are pretty tragic. Not only because they involve the deaths of 4 people and the assault of many others, but because a large number of them could have been prevented. Zion had been convicted twice of crimes involving assault, but in both cases, he was released early by a parole board. He later succeeded in cutting short the lives of 4 young boys before he was arrested again, this time for good. Zion was convicted of just 1 murder and received the death penalty, although this was later commuted to a life sentence. He was attacked and killed in prison by a fellow inmate, who was acquitted of the crime on the basis of insanity. Leroy Martin. Born and raised in Gaffney, South Carolina, Leroy Martin lived a seemingly normal life. He worked in a textile mill and had a wife and 3 children. Behind that facade, though, was a maniac who rained terror on women in the area and was responsible for the deaths of 4 people.
And I was getting a little eerie feeling as we got deeper into the woods, and finally one of the deputies said, "Here she is," and she was covered up with some brush.
After placing 2 calls himself to a newspaper editor, Martin was spotted close to a crime scene by 2 local residents and was later arrested by police.
You tell the sheriff his boys better catch me real soon or I'm gonna take me another one.
Why don't you just turn yourself in?
Nah, y'all gonna have to hunt me down and shoot me dead like the dog I am.
He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms, but only served about 4 years before he was put out of his misery by another inmate at the Central Correctional Institution in South Carolina.
Part of him wanted to be caught. I think another part of him enjoyed the publicity. He would get up every morning and go down to a local cafe and and get copies of all the papers and read and talk about the strangler.
Charles Schmid.
National media pounced, including Playboy and Life magazine, all to see the man, the murderer, with a personality bigger than life.
The Pied Piper of Tucson, Charles Schmid was a serial killer who claimed the lives of 3 young ladies in the 1960s. Schmid was known for hanging out with a group of teenagers in the Tucson area, and when he wanted to know what taking a life would feel like, he sought his victims within that group.
It was May 31st, 1964, when Schmid decided to fulfill a long-time desire to see what it would feel like to kill.
In the end, it was one of those same friends who was instrumental in helping the police build a winning case against him.
Richie Bruns got probation and was sent to Ohio, so he was so jittery, he called his father and told him all about what he knew about Schmid and the deaths.
After successfully escaping from the Arizona State Prison in 1972, Schmid was recaptured and sent back, where he met his end just 3 years later in a horrific attack by 2 other inmates. Robert Pickton.
One of the country's most notorious prisoners is dead. Robert Pickton has died from injuries sustained earlier in the month in a Quebec prison assault.
One of the most notorious serial killers in Canadian history, Robert Pickton was convicted of murdering 6 people, although he was charged with 21 and later confessed to 49. He mostly targeted sex workers in downtown Vancouver, picking them up and taking them to his pig farm, where he would kill and dispose of them. He was sentenced to life in prison and served his time in Quebec's Port Cartier institution. On May 19, 2024, Pickton was reportedly stabbed in the head with a broken broom handle by prisoner Martin Charret. He was rushed to the hospital and put on life support, but he died of his injuries 12 days later.
Well, as you said, Pickton was in that medically induced coma and on life support after he was attacked in what was described as a major assault by another inmate at that maximum security institution about 450 kilometers northeast of Quebec City.
James Whitey Bulger.
At the age of 14, Bulger had his first brush with the law, arrested and setting up a lifetime of being on the wrong side of the law.
Once the most wanted fugitive in America, James Whitey Bulger was an infamous mob boss who controlled the Winter Hill Gang in Somerville, Massachusetts. He also worked as an FBI informant for many years, which, unsurprisingly, did not make him many friends among his criminal associates. Bulger lived as a fugitive for 17 years, but was finally arrested in 2011 and handed 2 consecutive life sentences for his notorious crimes, including murder.
Whitey Bulger was found guilty on 31 counts, including both racketeering charges, and was found to have been involved in 11 murders.
He bounced around multiple prisons before being sent to the United States Penitentiary in Hazleton, West Virginia on October 29, 2018. In less than 24 hours, Bulger was ambushed by several inmates and left for dead in an unrecognizable state.
Investigative reporter Eric Rasmussen found out Bulger is the 3rd prisoner killed at that facility just this year.
Donald Harvey. While working as a hospital orderly in Ohio and Kentucky, Donald Harvey was responsible for the deaths of a self-proclaimed 87 people.
He was quite bizarre, and on certain levels, raised some doubts as to whether or not this guy was reciting some sort of fantasy.
Harvey employed several methods in what he deemed as a mercy killing of his patients, including the use of poisons, suffocation, and withholding essential medications.
They do narrow the list to 10 possible victims. All died of illnesses that could be a cover for poisons like arsenic, a substance found in large quantities at Harvey's apartment.
He pleaded guilty to 37 murders to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to life imprisonment. But when you describe yourself as an angel of death, chances are you're bound to get a taste of your own medicine at some point. This came in the form of James Elliott, a fellow inmate at the Toledo Correctional Institution in Ohio, who descended upon Harvey, being familiar with his crimes.
He placed himself in that position. I really don't have much compassion for him. He's, I said back then, and I'd say today, if he ever had gotten out, he would have continued to kill people.
Richard Loeb.
I think that the murder said something to people about American society. This was seen as a culmination of trends that were dangerous, that were immoral.
Richard Loeb and Nathan Leopold were 2 extremely intelligent students born to wealthy parents and fantasized about committing the perfect murder.
Wealthy, well-educated teenagers who had done it, they said, for the sheer thrill.
They found their victim in the young Bobby Franks, who paid the ultimate price on May 21st, 1924. The two got rid of the body, but mistakenly dropped a pair of eyeglasses at the scene, which were traced back to Leopold.
They found that only 3 pairs of eyeglasses with that hinge had been sold in the Chicago district.
They managed to evade the death penalty and were sentenced to life imprisonment instead. But while Leopold maintained a stellar record through his sentence and was eventually granted parole in 1958, Loeb's story took a gruesome turn. He met his end at the hands of another prisoner at the Stateville Penitentiary in Illinois, who viciously attacked him in the shower. Albert DeSalvo.
They were young and old, black and white. As the number of victims grew, police became more and more frustrated.
1960s Boston, Massachusetts was terrorized by 2 criminals. One dubbed the Boston Strangler, who killed 13 women, and the Green Man, who broke into women's homes and assaulted them.
The grisly headline-grabbing crimes had some comparing the Boston Strangler to Jack the Ripper.
As police launched an investigation into the Green Man's activities, they were pointed towards Albert DeSalvo, whom they arrested and charged with the crimes. While in custody, DeSalvo confessed to also being the Boston Strangler. But due to a lack of physical evidence, he was only tried for the Green Man allegations. DeSalvo was serving a life sentence when he died after being wounded by another inmate in the prison infirmary. Decades later, DNA evidence obtained from one of the victims would prove that DeSalvo was, in fact, the Boston Strangler.
It would appear to definitively determine, in fact, that Albert DeSalvo was the killer of Mary Sullivan.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into your settings and switch on notifications. Jeffrey Dahmer.
Jeffrey Dahmer was responsible for killing more than a dozen people. The majority of those murders happened in an apartment near the Marquette campus.
One of the most infamous serial killers to ever walk the earth, Jeffrey Dahmer was responsible for the deaths of 17 young men. His spree came to an end in July 1991, when an intended victim escaped from Dahmer's apartment and led the police back to him. He pleaded guilty to all the charges leveled against him and received 15 consecutive life sentences in Wisconsin and an additional one in Ohio. In prison, Dahmer was reportedly unremorseful for his crimes, which reportedly infuriated the aforementioned Christopher Scarver, resulting in an attack in the prison gym that left Dahmer dead. When news of his death reached the public, Dahmer's mother asked, quote, "Now is everybody happy?"
To many, including Dahmer's own attorney, it comes as little surprise.
I wasn't shocked because I thought that Jeffrey Dahmer would end up this way.
Scarver also killed Jesse Anderson, another convicted murderer, who just happened to be in the gym at the same time.
At his first court appearance, Scarver entered the courtroom singing.
Rain or shine, sharing your dreams.
What do you make of these stories? Let us know in the comments below.
I believe in God too. But my God is a God of vengeance.
Check out these other clips from WatchMojo, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.